Richard Ellison crossed his wife's name off the reserved seating chart with a single stroke of his pen, the way a man crosses off a grocery item he has decided he no longer needs. "Move her place setting," he said to Abby, his assistant, "and confirm the reservation under my name only. 2 seats." Abby wrote it down without a word. She had worked for Richard for 11 months, long enough to understand that questions were not part of her role. 17 years of marriage, rearranged in the time it takes to uncap a pen. Richard did not think of it as cruelty. He thought of it as logistics. Mara didn't love these events anyway. Events anyway, he told himself, though if anyone had exactly she had said that, he would have had considerable difficulty finding the moment. He believed it because it was convenient to believe it. And Richard Ellison had built an entire career on the remarkable human talent for mistaking convenience for truth. Before I tell you what happened next, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where in Canada you're watching from tonight, and if you're new to Ivory Secrets, welcome. Hit subscribe because you are going to want to stay until the very last word of this one. Richard Ellison was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of man people point to when they want an example of success. Senior partner at Eldridge & Holt, one of Bay Street's most respected litigation firms. A corner office on the 38th floor, overlooking downtown Toronto. The kind of handshake that closed rooms and opened doors simultaneously. He was 53 years old and had spent the better part of 3 decades making sure that his name meant something in every room he entered. The Canadian Legal Excellence Gala was, for Richard, more than a black-tie dinner at the Fairmont Royal York. It was a room that confirmed what he already believed about himself. Judges, senior partners, federal ministers. The kind of people who did not simply attend events, they ratified them by being present. He had been going for 12 years. He knew exactly where to stand, which conversations to open first, and how long to linger before moving on. What Richard had decided, 3 weeks before the gala, was that Mara was not the right person to have beside him this year. He had not arrived at this decision through any single dramatic moment. It was quieter than that. The accumulation of small calculations, the way frost accumulates on glass, one layer at a time, until one morning you can no longer see through it. A junior associate, named Aaron Vale, had been doing impressive work on a class action file. Aaron was 29, sharp, and familiar with the files of the 3 judges Richard most needed to speak with that evening. Having Aaron beside him made strategic sense. Having Mara beside him, Richard had concluded, made nothing. He told himself she would be relieved. A quiet evening at home, a glass of wine, her books. He told himself this so convincingly that by the time he instructed Abby to adjust the chart, he had almost manufactured a version of Mara in his mind who had actually agreed to stay home. Almost. What the world saw when it looked at Mara Ellison was precisely what Mara had decided it should see. A woman of 47 who carried herself quietly at her husband's events, who smiled at the right moments, who asked thoughtful questions of the people around her, and who deflected any questions about herself with a grace that most people misread as modesty. Richard's colleagues referred to her, warmly and without a trace of self-awareness, as Richard's lovely wife. At the firm's holiday party, someone had once described her to a new associate as very supportive. The new associate had nodded, because what else do you do with that? Nobody ever asked Mara what she did with her days. Nobody ever wondered what she was thinking behind those dark, even eyes that had the quality her mother had always called still water, the kind that looks calm from the surface, because all the power is running underneath. She had met Richard at a legal conference in Ottawa 18 years ago. She was 30, presenting a paper on access to justice gaps for low-income families in rural communities. He was 40, already a partner, and he walked up to her afterward with a confidence she had found genuinely attractive. "That was the best paper of the morning," he said. "I want to know more about what you think." He had seemed at the time to mean it. They married 16 months later. The early years were good, not perfect, but the kind of good that feels like enough, because the person beside you still turns to hear what you're about to say. Mara left her position at Osgoode Hall. To manage a legal aid clinic Richard had promised to fund. She threw herself into the work. The clinic thrived. The numbers improved. A woman named Linda Chen, who ran the province's largest donor network, pulled her aside after a board presentation and said, "You should be running something much bigger than this." Mara filed that away. She always filed things away. The first fracture appeared 4 years into the marriage, at a dinner party in their Rosedale home. Richard's oldest friend, a man named Bruce Whitfield, a real estate developer who wore his wealth like a second jacket, was holding court over the main course, complaining about a regulatory appeal that had cost him a major development contract. He'd lost, he said, because the government's lawyers had run rings around his team. Absolute nonsense ruling, Bruce declared. Politically motivated, any competent judge would have thrown it out. Mara, who had been listening quietly from the far end of the table, set down her fork. "The decision was Wakefield's, wasn't it?" she said. "Not a question." I read that appeal. "The problem wasn't the judge. The problem was your team's argument on standing. You didn't have it. The statute was clear." The table went quiet in the way that dinner tables go quiet when someone says something very accurate that nobody wanted, said out loud. Bruce looked at her, then at Richard, then back at her. He laughed, the short, uncomfortable laugh of a man deciding how to regain his footing. "Well," he said, "listen to the lawyer in the room." "I am a lawyer," Mara said pleasantly. Later, when the guests had gone, Richard found her in the kitchen. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "Do what?" "Take Bruce apart in front of everyone. He's been a client for 9 years. I pointed out why he lost a legal appeal. He's a proud man. He doesn't like being corrected." Mara placed a glass on the drying rack. She dried her hands. She looked at her husband for a long moment, with an expression he would describe to himself later as understanding. It was, in fact, something far more deliberate than that. "Can you just let me handle the professional conversations when we're with these people?" Richard said. "It makes the whole evening easier." Easier for whom, Mara thought. She didn't say it. She turned off the tap, and in the quiet of the kitchen, she made a decision. She would watch. She would see how deep this went. She watched for 13 years. What she saw was this. Richard's preference for her silence was not a phase. It was not early career insecurity that would fade. It was structural. Load-bearing. Richard needed a particular version of his wife to maintain a particular version of himself, and that version did not include her being right about things in rooms where he needed to be the most right person present. What? So Mara made a choice. Not the choice he assumed. Quiet acceptance, the slow erosion of a woman managed into smallness. The other kind, the kind her mother had described once, on a rainy Sunday in their family home in Charlottetown, when Mara was 16 and furious about something a teacher had said that was wrong and unfair, and had gone unchallenged. "Save it," her mother had told her, not dismissively, carefully. "A woman who spends all her fire proving herself in every small room has nothing left when the real one comes along. Wait for the room that matters, then walk in fully." Mara had never forgotten those words. 11 years ago, she had founded the Bright Path Foundation. She had done it methodically, without announcement, without telling Richard until the entity was already incorporated and operating. By the time she mentioned it, casually, over dinner, framed as a small volunteer initiative, it had already placed pro bono, legal representation in 4 Ontario cities and was processing its first federal grant application. Richard had said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and reached for the salt. He had not asked a single follow-up question. The Bright Path Foundation grew the way things grow when they are tended by someone with absolute clarity of purpose. It provided free legal representation to women navigating domestic violence cases, custody disputes, and immigration proceedings, the crossroads where vulnerability and the law met in the most unforgiving ways. Within 3 years, it was operating in 6 provinces. Within 6, it had a full-time legal staff of 22, a network of nearly 500 pro bono partner lawyers across the country, and had directly supported over 11,000 women through the Canadian courts. Mara ran it from her home office in Rosedale. Richard thought she spent her mornings reading. The invitation to the Canadian Legal Excellence Gala had arrived in January, addressed to Mara, not as Richard's wife, but as the executive director and founder of the Bright Path Foundation. The Canadian Justice Foundation had named her the recipient of the Justice Innovation Award, the highest honor the gala presented each year. The chair of the selection committee, a justice of the Ontario Court of Appeal named Susan Park, had called personally. The committee had voted unanimously, Susan told her, which, in 12 years of the award, had never happened before. Mara had accepted. She had added it to her calendar. She had not told Richard. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, but in the part of herself where she kept the things she knew, but it did not yet say aloud, she understood. She was waiting to see one final time what he would do when left to his own choices. Now she knew. The notification came on a Tuesday evening, forwarded from the gala's administrative platform. A seating change had been applied to the Ellison reservation. Her place at the head table, where award recipients were seated, had been. Mara read it in her home office, sitting in the chair she had occupied for 11 years, while building something most of Canada's legal community would consider extraordinary, and which her husband considered a hobby. She set her phone on the desk. Outside, the maple in the backyard was coming into leaf, the particular pale green of early May in Toronto, tentative and certain at the same time. She had planted that tree 6 years ago. Richard had once pointed it out to a neighbor as one of the landscaping improvements we had done, which was true only in the sense that Mara had in fact done it herself with her own hands on a Saturday afternoon while Richard was at the office. She thought about that for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Dana. Dana Coe had been with the foundation since the beginning, since the first cramped office on Queen Street West, since the first intake system built from scratch over 3 overwhelming months. She was 38, precise and unflappable, the kind of person who could manage a crisis and a budget revision without either suffering. "I need something from you," Mara said. "Name it." "Confirm my attendance at the Justice Foundation Gala Thursday, not as a guest, as the award recipient. Make sure Susan's office knows I'll be arriving independently, and that I'd like to be introduced by my title and the foundation's name." A brief pause. Dana understood enough of Mara's private life to read the weight of what was being said. "Done before morning," Dana said. "Are you all right?" Mara looked at the maple through the window, at the leaves she had chosen and planted, and watched. Come back every spring in a garden her husband had for years described to strangers as professionally maintained. "I'm better than I've been in a very long time," she said, and she meant it entirely. The Fairmont Royal York wore Thursday evening, the way it always wore important nights, with the particular self-assurance of a building that has hosted enough history to stop being impressed by it. The ballroom filled from 7 o'clock with the kind of gathering that the Canadian legal world reserved for its most significant moments. Justices, senior counsel, federal ministers, the architects of the country's biggest public interest cases. Richard arrived at 7:15 with Aaron beside him, both in black tie, moving through the entrance with the ease of men who knew the room. By 8 o'clock, he had located Alan Forsyth, a retired justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, with a long memory for the lawyers, who had argued well in front of him. They shook hands warmly. "I was surprised not to see Mara on the guest list," Alan said, partway through their conversation. Said naturally, without particular emphasis, the way you mention something you simply expected to be true. Richard arranged his expression into something warm and practiced. "Mara prefers quieter evenings," he said. "This world has never quite been her scene." Alan looked at him for a beat that lasted slightly longer than comfortable. "Is that right?" he said, not as a question. Richard didn't notice. He was already scanning the room for Susan Park. At 9 o'clock, Susan stepped to the podium. She was 61, with the measured diction and complete absence of performative gravitas that belongs to people who have held real authority long enough to stop needing to announce it. The room settled immediately. Before we move to this evening's award presentations, Susan said, I want to acknowledge a woman who has operated one of the most consequential access to justice organizations in this country's history for 11 years. You may not have known her name until recently. That was, as I understand it, entirely intentional. The room was completely still. The Bright Path Foundation has supported more than 11,000 women in legal proceedings across 6 provinces. It has partnered with nearly 500 lawyers in pro bono practice. It has changed in the most tangible legal sense the outcomes of thousands of lives, quietly, systematically, and without a single press release in 11 years of operation. The Justice Innovation Award this year goes, unanimously and without hesitation, to its founder and executive director. Susan looked toward the entrance. Please welcome Mara Ellison. The doors opened. She had owned the dress for 2 years, a deep charcoal gown she had bought in Vancouver during a site visit to the Foundation's westernmost office, a trip she had told Richard was a university friend's birthday weekend. She had looked at it on the rack and known immediately that she was saving it for something. This was the something. Later, the people in that room would try to describe what happened when Mara walked in and find that the honest description required more precision than most social language allows. What they would say was that the room went quiet. What they meant was something closer to. The quality of attention changed. The specific, tangible shift that happens when a room full of people who know something very well encounters someone who knows it better. Alan Forsyth, mid-sentence with a colleague, stopped speaking. He straightened in his chair. He turned fully. Susan began to applaud from the podium. The nearest table joined her, then the next, and then the sound rolled through the ballroom the way genuine recognition rolls. Not polite, not obligatory, but real. The sound people make when someone arrives who they have been waiting to see properly acknowledged for a long time. Mara walked through it with the composure of a woman who has arrived, not who is performing arrival. Her expression was open, settled, entirely present. She was 47 years old, and she was exactly where she had always belonged. Across the room, Richard Ellison heard Susan Park say his wife's name. He heard Bright Path Foundation. He heard 11,000 women, 6 provinces, 11 years. His champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He turned. He saw Mara. What Richard's face did in that moment was not something he would have chosen. It moved through shock and confusion, and then, underneath both of those, something slower and more terrible than shock. The recognition that arrives by degrees, the way cold arrives, until you realize you have been standing in it for a very long time without understanding what you were feeling. He watched Alan Forsyth stand to embrace her, with the warmth of a man who has great respect and has been waiting to express it in the proper setting. He watched Susan descend from the podium to meet Mara as equals. He watched the room reorganize itself around a different center of gravity. Not because anyone had orchestrated it, because the room was responding to something real, and real things have gravity. He found her in the corridor off the main ballroom 20 minutes later. It was carpeted in deep blue, lit warmly, quiet in the way of places adjacent to loud rooms. She had seen him coming. She always saw things coming. "Hello, Richard," she said. He stopped 2 feet from her, the same 2 feet that had existed between them for months, in their bed, at their dining table, in every room they shared without quite sharing. "How long?" he said. 11 years for the foundation." 11. He stopped, pressed his fingers briefly to his mouth. 11,000 women. And counting. He looked at his wife. He looked at the face he had looked at across 17 years of mornings and firm events and dinners where he had introduced her, without once pausing to wonder whether what he was saying was accurate. As my wife, Mara. Not this specific person, not this extraordinary person. Just my wife. The appendage, the qualifier. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. There was no anger in his voice. There was something worse than anger. The stunned quiet of a man who has just looked at a wall he has lived. beside for years and understood for the first time that it was a door. Mara considered him with the expression that was clear, the way still water is clear, not cold, not performing warmth, simply present in a way that required him to be present too, which was uncomfortable, because he had spent 17 years filling their spaces with his own noise. I tried, she said, in different ways, in different years. I tried to show you what I was working on. Every time I started, she paused, choosing the precise words as she always had. You listened for about 40 seconds and then redirected the conversation to your caseload, or your firm, or someone you needed to impress. It wasn't deliberate, Richard. I know that. It was automatic. As if you couldn't hold my work in your attention because you'd already decided it didn't belong in the same category as yours. The hallway was very quiet. The dinner party, he said slowly. Bruce, the appeal ruling. That was the beginning, wasn't it? That was when I decided to stop showing you things I wasn't sure you could see. He exhaled. I told Alan tonight that you prefer quiet evenings, that this world has never been your scene. Mara held his gaze. Alan and I have corresponded about access to justice reform for 4 years. Richard closed his eyes briefly, opened them. I moved your name off the seating chart without a conversation. Without a reason, I replaced you with Aaron. I know. Mara, his voice came out lower than he intended, rougher. I'm sorry. She looked at him steadily. The apology was real. She could hear that. It had the sound that real apologies have, unpolished, not reaching far enough to cover what it's apologizing for, and honest enough to know it. I know you are, she said. That's where we start. A door at the far end of the corridor opened briefly, releasing a wash of music and voices from the ballroom, then closed again. What happens now? He said. Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside, past the old stone walls of the Fairmont, Toronto was doing what Toronto does, at 10 o'clock on a Thursday in May, moving, lit, full of the particular restless energy of a city that has never stopped having opinions about itself. That, she said, is the first honest question you've asked me in a very long time. She was not cruel when she said it, she was precise. And precision, Mara had always believed, was a more profound form of kindness than softness, because at least it respected the other person enough to tell them the truth. I'm going back in, she said. I have people to speak with tonight, real conversations. She paused. You should find Alan, tell him the truth about who you brought, instead of your wife, and what you said about her this evening. Not because you owe me the performance of it, because you owe yourself the honesty. She turned. She walked back toward the ballroom. Richard stood in the blue-carpeted corridor for a long time after she left. He thought about 17 years. He thought about 11,000 women whose outcomes had changed because of work his wife had built quietly in a home office, while he moved through the world, assuming he was the most significant thing moving through their shared life. He thought about Alan's face when the applause started, the expression of a man seeing something publicly confirmed that he had privately known for years. He thought about his own mother, who had also been quiet, who had also been described by his father as not particularly interested in business things, and who had managed every financial decision of the family with a precision that became visible only when she was gone, and everything fell apart without her. He did not go back into the ballroom immediately. He sat in the corridor and did something he had not done in recent memory. He tried to think honestly, not strategically, not from the position of managing a narrative. Just honestly. It took longer than he expected. He had considerably more practice with the other kind. The Financial Post ran the story Friday morning. The journalist, a woman named Sophie Kwan, who covered the intersection of law and social justice, had spoken with Mara briefly the previous evening. The piece was careful, specific, and thorough. It covered 11 years, named numbers and provinces, quoted Susan Park, calling the foundation the most effective access to justice infrastructure built in Canada in a generation, and quoted Alan Forsyth, saying he had known about Mara's work for 4 years, and had been waiting for the country to catch up to what she had accomplished. The last line of the piece was a direct quote. Sophie had asked. For 11 years, you built something of national significance without seeking any public recognition. Why change that now? And Mara had looked at her for a moment and said, because someone tried to erase my name from a room I had helped build, and I decided that was the last time. Sophie had written it down exactly. Richard read it at 6:40 in the morning, standing in the kitchen with his coffee, going cold beside him. He read the last line 3 times. He set his phone face down on the counter and stood for a long time looking at the window above the sink, where the early May light was coming through the maple leaves. His wife's maple, planted by his wife's hands, in his wife's garden, which he had for years described to anyone who admired it as the result of a landscaper they'd been happy with. He called her. I read it, he said. I know, she said. Dana sent me the link an hour ago. The last line. Yes. Silence. Can we talk, he said, properly. Not on the phone. I need to understand what I've been doing. Not in general, specifically. I want you to tell me. A pause. He counted the seconds without meaning to. Sunday, she said. The house, 2 o'clock. I'll be there. Richard. Her voice shifted slightly. Come ready to listen, not to defend. Just listen. All right, he said, and for the first time in their marriage, those 2 words cost him something real. He drove himself to the house on Sunday. He had not been back since Thursday morning. He parked in the driveway. He sat in the car for 3 minutes. Then he went inside. Mara was in the living room, not the formal sitting room, the room they had actually lived in, the one with the worn sofa and the bookshelves, holding every book she had read, since they moved into this house, and which he had walked past for years without asking. She had made tea. She had not asked whether he wanted it. He sat down across from her. He set 3 pages of a legal pad on the table between them. Every moment he could recall redirecting her in conversation, every professional where he had introduced her and moved on. Before anyone could ask her a question, every evening, she had started to tell him something about the foundation, and he had let the conversation drift back toward his own orbit. He had written for 2 hours. He had not stopped because he ran out of moments. He had stopped because his hand was shaking. I wanted you to see that I'm not asking for general absolution, he said. I needed to look at it specifically. What I actually did. How many times? Mara looked at the pages without touching them. The dinner with Bruce, she said. First on the list. The Law Society panel, 2019. You were presenting. I was in the audience. A panelist asked what I thought of the access gaps you discussed, and you stepped in and answered for me. Second page, Richard said quietly. Mara looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not toward warmth yet, but away from distance, marginally, measurably. My mother, she said finally. She told me once, wait for the room that matters, then walk in fully, she paused. I waited a long time, Richard, longer than I should have needed to. He looked at the pages on the table, then at his wife. I kept you out of the rooms, he said. You tried, she said simply. I kept building anyway. The silence that followed was the heaviest and most honest thing that had existed between them in years. Not comfortable. There was nothing comfortable about it. But real, the kind that only exists between 2 people who have, at least temporarily, performed. Stop. Where do we go from here? He asked. Mara turned the question over with the care she gave everything that deserved it. I don't know yet, she said. What I know is that wherever I go as myself. Not as your wife first, and a person second. Not quieter than I am, so other people's rooms feel safer. She paused. If we go anywhere together, it will be because you can see who I actually am, not who you've been telling yourself I was. I want to, he said. I won't pretend to be further along than I am. Mara looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and picked up the 3 pages from the table. She read them, all of them, slowly, while Richard sat across from her and felt more exposed than he had been in any courtroom in his life. When she finished, she set them down. You missed some, she said. I know. But this, she said, is a start. And in the quiet that held them both in the house they had shared for 17 years without quite sharing, Sprisal, something shifted. Not resolved, not repaired, not the clean final landing that 17 years of compressed truth might have deserved. Something harder than that, something real. Her mother had told her, wait for the room that matters, then walk in fully. Mara Ellison had walked into that room on a Thursday evening in May. She had stood in the light that had always been hers. She had not destroyed anyone on her way in. She had simply arrived, fully. Without apology, without the careful editing of a woman who had spent too many years making herself smaller for the comfort of rooms that had never been worth the sacrifice. And she was never, not for a single moment after that night, going to let anyone move her name from a room she had helped to build. She had built too many of them, quietly, over too many years to ever allow that again.